A core element of risk right now is uncertainty. Uncertainty about the trajectory of the virus, uncertainty about economic and financial impact.
Hello and welcome to a special coronavirus edition of GZERO World. I'm Ian Bremmer, and this show is a tough one. In all the decades I've been examining global risk, this pandemic could be the worst near-term scenario I've ever seen. I'll explain. Then I'll sit down for a deeper dive on the political impacts of where this virus began, China, with former Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. I'll say a number. You say whatever pops into your mind. Ready? 300. I'll go first and last because I can't hear you. In antiquity, 300 was the number of Spartans who fended off 1 million Persian invaders. In bowling, it's a perfect score. But today, 300 signifies the number in millions of school children around the world missing class due to coronavirus. The global scale and speed of the current educational disruption is unparalleled. That's a direct quote from the United Nations. Already some 24 countries on 3 continents have shuttered their schools. In Japan alone, 38,000 schools are closed. Let's expand the focus. The broader effects of coronavirus are clear. It is the first global crisis of the Trump administration. I was really hoping we could avoid that. The virus has spread to at least 70 countries, roiled international markets, undercut growth for the global economy, and prompted the World Bank to pledge $12 billion in loans to help battle it back. Rest assured, here in the United States, leadership understands facts, values expertise, and is ready to take the helm.
I like this stuff. I really get it. People are surprised that I understand it. Every one of these doctors said, "How do you know so much about this?"
To be sure, there are signs the U.S. is taking coronavirus more seriously than that. President Trump recently signed an $8.3 billion emergency spending bill to ramp up testing, aid, and prevention efforts, more than 3 times what he asked for. But just how big this crisis will get still isn't clear. There are at least 2 distinct possibilities. Scenario 1 is bounce back. China's heavy-handed tactics, travel restrictions, and quarantines contain the spread. Its economy gets back on track. Europe also manages as the virus proves seasonal in transmission. Emerging economies are harder hit, but most weather the storm. Markets stabilize, and by November time in the United States, the election is no longer about coronavirus. Scenario 2, a lack of global coordination allows for new cases to keep expanding. The Chinese economy slows for real. Western companies cut China from their supply chains. Beijing and the West move toward Cold War. Meanwhile, new outbreaks emerge globally. Panic buying ramps up, shortages ensue, and markets fall, contributing to Trump's worst poll numbers to date, just ahead of U.S. general elections, forcing the president to engage in even harder political tactics against his opponents. Similar stories unfold in Latin America and Europe, putting new pressures on populist governments as social discontent climbs higher. Global travel plummets, consumer confidence weakens, and for the first time in more than a decade, the world heads deep into recession, only this time without the benefit of a coordinated global response. Internal strife and even regional wars become more likely. There's little evidence any of this has served as a wake-up. Recently, an emergency conference call of G7 finance ministers and central bankers came away with no collective strategy. Instead, they promised to closely monitor ongoing developments. Piecemeal approach to a global crisis. Founding president of Asia Society Policy Institute and former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd. Good to be with you, Kevin.
Good to be with you, Professor Bremmer.
Yes, indeed. So I'm going to start with your recent tweet. If I were in office today, ? I'd pick up the phone to Washington and seek a meeting of G20 leaders, health ministers, and finance ministers. Markets need to see the world's 20 biggest economies are acting together in solidarity and will use stimulus as needed to overcome coronavirus. Not happening.
It isn't. And for me, it's one of the most puzzling things. You see, markets are in the business of pricing risk and opportunity, but right now they're pricing risk. And a core element of risk right now is uncertainty. Uncertainty about the trajectory of the virus, uncertainty about economic and financial impact. So my experience from the events of 08-09 is that markets were in free fall from the time we got the Lehman's collapse until March of 09, when we convened at G20 level, 20 largest economies in the world.
With this idea of a coordination effort to maximize the benefits of common action and common purpose.
And so it was an agreed monetary fiscal policy approach. We agreed not to kill each other with protectionism, and we agreed on a future regulatory approach, including stress testing of major financial institutions. And markets at that point arrested their fall. And if you look at the graph, that's when they began recovering. That's the parallel time frame I think we're in at the moment.
Do you see any remote possibility of that happening today?
I see some. You see, it wasn't just some global kumbaya moment where we all felt better in the morning. It was everyone's collective analysis, individual analysis of their national self-interest, which said, A, this thing's bigger than any of us, even at that stage, bigger than the United States nationally, and B, no response would be greeted credibly by markets unless it was a collective response involving the major economies. Now, the same logic applies now. So your question is it possible now? Look, President Trump is President Trump, who spent the last 3 years trashing most multilateral institutions. But if you look at the extent of the market collapse in America right now and around the world, and we know the president watches financial markets and stock markets acutely, it's sending a very big signal, which is, Mr. President, we need certainty here. At two levels, what's the effect of global collaboration on virus management, prevention and vaccine development? And on the public economic policy side, what are you going to do to deal with what will become a serious cash flow problem for a whole bunch of firms who are most exposed to the immediate impact of the virus and its consequences?
What do you think a plausible first step would be to get us in a direction of global cooperation, and who would take it?
I think the first step has to be a bilateral one between Beijing and Washington. And what I would recommend is a joint coronavirus task force between the White House and Zhongnanhai. But so long as America's friends and allies around the world and some of China's friends see Washington and Beijing at daggers drawn in this exercise, and the likelihood of pulling together a G20 summit, a virtual summit, quickly by video link, even a working level summit at finance health ministers level will be undermined.
There have been two narratives, very different, about China's role in all of this. First, that they very desperately badly mishandled the initial phases of this outbreak. And second, that the Chinese are the only country that has been able to contain it, that the numbers are going down, and that actually more states should be looking to a Chinese model to be able to respond to coronavirus. Give me your initial reactions to that.
Well, to both the narratives you've just described, my answers would be yes and probably yes. Yes to the first, which is the outbreak of this evidences the worst elements of a top-down, hierarchical, authoritarian political system where people at the bottom point, that is those at the service delivery point, were frankly simply unable to get a message out to the rest of the national system, early warnings, and to the world. In fact, the more you drill back, the more it was plain that there was work going on at a grassroots level from the early parts of December. So that's a failure of their system. Now, when it comes to reacting to this thing at scale and with intensity, it's a bit like finally altering the course of the Queen Mary when it used to be the largest ocean-going ship in the world. Once it's gone, bonk, then it's all systems go, all pistons driving in one direction. And with, I'm sure, massive abuses of human rights and civil liberties on the way through. But I looked too carefully at what the recent WHO visiting mission of experts said recently, and they were strongly supportive of the disease management systems that the Chinese had put in.
This is by far the biggest crisis Xi Jinping has had to deal with under his leadership so far. What have you learned about him as a consequence of watching the last few months?
The first thing you learn about Xi Jinping through this is he rapidly concluded that this was a central threat to his own authority unless he handled the crisis effectively. And that is not just for external show. It's because they know, and he knows in particular, that unless properly managed, what happens with a crisis like this, which affects the entire population potentially, is that it threatens the very nature of the social contract between a communist party, which says on the one hand, give me your civil liberties and your political freedoms, and on the other hand, I'll give you security and economic prosperity. So he very quickly deduced that this was a threat to him. So what's my estimation at this stage? Xi Jinping will continue, but that those who are thinking of not allowing him to continue will have more arguments to throw on the table, including this.
How confident do you feel that the case numbers that we're now seeing come out of China in any way reflect the reality?
The more I read from Chinese sources and international sources, we, I think, can safely conclude that there are real question marks about the quantum of the Chinese reporting about overall infection rates. And you see, and the reason for challenging that is when you start to look at the rate of infection in non-Chinese environments, for example, in South Korea and also in Italy. And if you were to apply those back into the Chinese system,
Exploded a lot faster.
You would think that in the early phases, it was much greater than has been reported. Yeah. So I'm skeptical about that. Mm-hmm. What I'm less skeptical about is the actual mortality rate, because that seems to be consistent between both reporting from within China and reporting outside of China. So where does that leave us? I think it leaves us with a conclusion that the overall number of people affected in China by way of infection will be much greater. The total number of deaths will be much greater, but still with a constant mortality rate.
And does that give you any reason to believe that the Chinese government will be effective in restarting its economy in relatively short order?
I think the first quarter of 2020 will be negative growth. In fact, if we see
China, an actual contraction.
An actual contraction. If we see Chinese public data indicating positive growth, I think that will invite a whole lot of question marks about the credibility of the data. And the reason for that is that you've seen all the traffic analyses of road density, of traffic density, as well as satellite imagery of what's happening in terms of pollution levels. This economy effectively ground to a halt. And so, therefore, we're going to see very bad data for the first quarter. Open question in terms of the second quarter.
What are the knock-on effects for Chinese foreign policy, for China's role in the world?
That is a global public relations exercise for the Chinese state. This has not been good. And it goes back to our earlier part of our conversation, which is how did this erupt? And the system itself should have identified, notified, and contained this at an earlier level than it did. Of course, the Chinese state and party apparatus will be saying, but hang on, we've had the most effective system in putting this under control. That'll be the counter-narrative. But the third bit, which worries me more than the first and the second, is this. It has actually at a popular level led to, I think, an even deeper poisoning of the US-China relationship. Again, a continued failure on the part of the US administration, in my judgment, to differentiate between the Chinese people, the Chinese nation, and frankly, the Chinese Communist Party. And even on the Communist Party front, I would not be engaging in an ideological war with the Chinese Communist Party in the middle of a national crisis.
And what about confidence inside China about the Chinese system?
Well, within China itself, if you go to Chinese social media, a bit like international reactions, there are two narratives. The internal narrative on the positive side, when they look at Xi Jinping's response, the most common term used in the Chinese social media response is 这么厉害, which is how strong is that in terms of the measures in Wuhan, the measures in
the hospitals
Hubei,
that were built
the hospitals.
in 10 days. Yeah.
Only Xi Jinping could do that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the other narrative is what we saw also in social media recently, not just over the tragic death of Li Wenliang.
The doctor.
Yeah, the young doctor who tried to notify, got sanctioned by the Communist Party and punished by the Communist Party, and then contracted the virus and died. at the
The
age of
coronavirus whistleblower, functionally.
Yeah, that's right. He's age of 34. So when a Politburo member just in the last several days went on a walking tour of Wuhan, then from the tops of the apartments blocks where this Politburo member was walking, you could hear through the social media people shouting "Jiada, Jiada, Jiada," which means it's all BS. And
we're in an election season right now in the United States. If Biden is the nominee, do you think, personally, that Trump or Biden would actually be better for the U.S.-China relationship?
I'm just a mere foreigner in your country. How could I express a preference for a Republican or a Democrat?
Not a preference for who should win, just who might be better for the U.S.-China relationship. I'm wondering if you have a view on that.
Look, Vice President Biden has one singular advantage, and that is he knows Xi Jinping relatively well, and not least because he spent a couple of weeks with the guy when, as Vice President of China, Xi Jinping visited this country. And that Biden had the same opportunity running around China. So if there are two individuals who actually know each other well, it's these two, because they have spent extended time with each other and in places other than across the negotiating table. So I think that's important. Secondly, I think the team that Vice President Biden is likely to assemble will be made up of people who are fairly hard line on China, but people whose length and breadth of foreign policy and international economic policy experience is more likely to produce an integrated China strategy.
All the names that we know from Biden land for a long time, yeah.
So when you look at President Trump, by contrast, you have the announcement of a new national security strategy in November, December of 2017, which is the formal redefinition from engagement to China being a strategic competition. But since then, we seem to see arms of US strategy going every which way. Will a second-term Trump administration get its act together and deliver a coherent strategy? Well, you're a keener observer of developments in Washington than I am. But that would be my overall, on balance, comparison.
Kevin Rudd, good to be with you. Thanks a lot.
Good to be with you.
Thanks to the faculty at SACEN for sharing their stories. Switching gears now. On this week's Puppet Regime, President Trump traveled to India and he and Prime Minister Modi made some beautiful music together.
Thank you for visiting India, President Trump.
It's great to be in a place where the people really get me.
We have much in common.
Are you thinking what I'm thinking?
I am. Hit it, Rajiv. It's Modi and the Dawn with the strongman song. Let's make it great. Namo and Donnie love to hate. From the time our eyes first met, our great destiny was set to bring our nations close. And man, I really admire your Muslim band. We both want to fight Beijing, but kind of envy Xi Jinping. Man, unna mo tera kai. You have bucks and so do I. It's Modi and the Dawn with the strongman song. Let's make it great. Namo and Donnie love to hate.
Howdy Modi, hi to Chennai. Hello Hyderabad, yes Mumbai. I'm the most Indian guy there is. All my kids stay in the family biz. Your people love me, so I'm told. We share a beautiful love of gold. Now come and join my GOP. It's like another elephant deity. So slap my name on the Taj Mahal. It would be my second Taj Mahal. Really, I had one before.
That's it for this week. If you like what you see, and I know you do because that's why you come every week to this show, check us out at GZEROmedia.com.